Welcome everybody, welcome to today's webinar. My name's Steve Moore. I lead the global customer success team here at WeLocalize. And it's great to see everybody joining. I can see some familiar names and some names I'm less familiar with, so you're all very, very welcome. It's great to see everybody could join us today. We'll get started in a minute or two. While we're waiting, just for anybody that is new to us or would like some background, WeLocalize is a trusted global language services provider. We work with global businesses in a variety of industries to reach, to engage, and to help them grow international audiences by delivering a range of language solutions and a range of different services. Anyone that does know WeLocalize, I think, knows how much we enjoy and encourage the knowledge sharing, the information exchange, the networking that happens at our events. And the goal today is to continue this and to provide some content for everybody that gives global companies some takeaways, some actionable strategies, and the chance to take part and to ask questions of your peers in the localization industry. So again, you're all very, very welcome. Just to confirm, the theme of today's webinar is time to consider language as an investment and not a cost. Time to consider language as an investment and not a cost. So we're going to touch on various topics. I think we're going to touch on topics like how to influence key stakeholders to see language as an investment. We're going to touch on topics like what are the common challenges in the role and the perception of language strategy and localization in global companies. And hopefully we're going to touch on how to measure and how to demonstrate content performance and return on investment in localization. So very soon, you're going to meet our guests. We've got some great guests for you today. Some quick housekeeping before we do that. We're scheduled for about 45 minutes. We are able to stay longer, but we're scheduled for 45 minutes today. We are planning to share a recording of the session with everybody that's registered later this week. And there is Q&A. We have a questions panel. So please do share your questions for the panelists on the Q&A tab. I'll be monitoring that throughout the webinar. So let's get started. It's my pleasure to introduce you to three fantastic professionals from our industry. So if I can ask everybody to introduce yourself, please, starting with Christina.
Hi, everyone. Great to be here. My name is Cristina Treviño. I lead the marketing localization team in Atlassian, where I have been for the last almost 6 years. For those of you who might not know, Atlassian is a software company that builds products like Jira, Confluence, Jira Service Management, or Trello that help teams across over 200,000 customers to organize, plan, communicate, and work collaboratively. I have been involved in localization for the last 15 to 16 years, and I'm very excited to be part of this webinar today. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Christina. And Nancy, you're very welcome.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Nancy Ferreira da Rocha. I'm the program manager of the localization program at FedEx Express. For the ones who don't know, FedEx is one of the largest logistics companies in the world. I've been in the localization business also, like Christina, around 15, 16 years. Sometimes you lose count. And I'm pretty excited about joining this webinar and really looking forward to this discussion.
Thanks, Nancy. And Alison.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alison Toon. I'm a senior analyst with CSA Research, where my specialist areas are in translation management, technology, processes, and also on the enterprise business side, because my long history in localization was on the with large enterprises.
Thanks, Alison. And I think you're going to kick us off today by showing us some interesting data points and analysis.
Yeah, I am. Thank you. And thank you for the introduction. For those of you who are not yet familiar with CSA Research, we specialize in independent and objective market research and data services for the localization industry, including both for enterprises, B2B and B2C, so consumer and business, and also for providers of language services and language technology. But our biggest audience is enterprises, and like I just said, that's where my background is. Today, I'm going to be focusing on data from several of our services, including the Global Revenue Forecaster, Can't Read, Won't Buy, and some research around pricing. Now, when we talk with localization teams about metrics, and right now I'm in the middle of a big research project about dashboards, so I'm talking to a lot of businesses, we still hear about the old measures: cost per word, turnaround time, translation errors, match rates, TM, MT. Now, these are all really important operations metrics, and it's the data that makes sure that projects are on track, that you're not spending above expectations, and they show that you have a way to quantify quality. However, these metrics by themselves are pretty meaningless at the executive or the company level. We can turn this around by using reliable data about TAM, so total addressable market, spending power, vertical markets, and language needs. You really have to translate localization language into CEO speak. ROI, return on investment, TAM, total addressable market, CSAT, customer satisfaction, NPS, net promoter score. These are all the sort of terms that the executive level talks in. And I'll share a few examples in action that can help you to translate the story of localization to this executive speak. Now, one thing that we found is that many organizations just do not measure the value of translation and languages by revenue. Last year, we ran a global survey of 563 buyers of language services from many different vertical markets. We asked them about pricing models, about how their LSPs calculate the cost of translation, and we also asked questions about business practices. And this graphic comes from the report, How Popular Are Per Word Pricing Models. It makes it very clear that more buyers consider cost and savings than ROI and the revenue that's enabled through language. Think about it. If you put your metrics in the terms of cost avoidance, it really focuses on the negative, while ROI, return on investment, shows the positives of using languages. And just a note, on our slides, you'll always see N number, the number of responses. And in this case, it's 1,079 responses from 244 buyers around the world. Only 50% of these respondents said that they consider company revenue and the ROI of language services as a measure of the value of translation. And I'm pretty certain that that 50% is aspirational, in that they saw the option in the survey and said, yeah, we really should be doing that, so I'm going to click yes. Now, we need that to be closer to 100%. If you ask the same question of global marketing teams, what do you think their answer would be? I'm pretty sure they will be measuring the return on their investment in their marketing campaigns. So let's take a look at how we can use data together with your operational localization metrics to show the value of language. You can use data to validate decisions on which languages to prioritize. For example, the CSA Global Revenue Forecaster can produce reliable predictive data in terms of actual revenue projections for your vertical market or for your organization itself. Now, in these charts here, we're seeing some detailed predictions of revenue by language for an example company that we've called Acme Medical. So I like to think of the forecaster as a dashboard that enables you to play around with ROI calculations specific to your vertical market and organization. And just in case you're wondering, the calculations for the Global Revenue Forecaster They're based on 8,000 data points about economic factors, language preferences, age, income distribution, multilingualism, across 540 locales, 180 languages, 37 industry sectors, and a whole lot more, including vertical market data for specific reports that we create. There's 18,000 calculations behind it. So it comes up with some very reliable scenarios. Now, we've got two scenarios here that I'll talk about. On the left, for our company Acme, the languages that are on the grey rows are the current languages that Acme offers, while the ones in blue are new languages that they're evaluating. They're considering adding these languages to their portfolio. The numbers that you see under revenue here are uplift figures. It's the incremental revenue that they would gain by adding a language rather than the total. For example, Dutch shows up quite low in the chart because so many of Acme's Dutch customers speak English, and so the incremental revenue from adding Dutch was quite low. So that's one way you can use this data to talk to executives in terms of revenue. Now, on the right-hand side here, we're showing that you can also use this data to evaluate the effect of dropping a language. In this case, if Acme was really pushed hard and had to choose to drop some languages to save budget, the least harm to revenue would come from dropping Catalan, Greek, or Polish, because they're right at the bottom. So if you know your localization costs and you have this data, you can use this information to push back against ill-conceived suggestions for cost cutting. You're really now talking CEO speak. Now, all of this data becomes even more significant as a result of the pandemic. We analysed how dropping languages in response to a severe downturn can affect organisations. And this chart is based on a study that we did for an actual company. For this company, their quarterly revenue had been growing slowly but steadily, and the organisation predicted a continuation of this trend in 2020 and beyond. Little did they know what was around the corner with the pandemic, and that's where it just goes down. After COVID struck, it saw a substantial and immediate revenue loss, followed by a V-shaped recovery. That's the 32% on this chart, to a lower level with predicted slower growth starting in Q4 2020. The cumulative revenue loss following the pandemic for the period shown was 32%. With these revenue losses, the company started to evaluate various cost-saving measures, including the elimination of languages. CSA research calculated that if the company was to eliminate localization for several of its less significant languages, it would result in an additional 7% decrease in cumulative revenue as the company loses both current and potential customers because they're no longer able to interact with the brand. So saving a few $100,000 in response to the immediate crisis would therefore cost the company billions in future revenue. And that's a self-inflicted wound on top of that from the pandemic. Now, another way to talk CEO speak or executive speak, another area to focus on is connecting the dots with high-level objectives. For example, your executives may be talking about supply chain optimization for the entire company, and that is a huge buzzword right now in many industry conferences. In this situation, we see localization teams focus on the operational metrics for cost cutting, measuring the cost per word down to minute detail. But this is just a small part of purchasing, of the supply chain process. So within the supply chain optimization, by stepping back and looking at the bigger picture, you might identify other areas to show value to the company without damaging your localization budget. And as an example, this graph is from the report Buying Translation Services. it shows that the vast number of companies that insist on issuing a new purchase order for each and every translation project. That's 53% at the top. There is so much waste in this, and there are many better ways to manage your purchases. So if your company has a focus this year on supply chain optimization at the highest level, then this may be a way to connect localization and your operational metrics with a major company goal and to show success. So if you're guilty of issuing many purchase orders, we really should talk about it. Now, I'll just mention briefly some of the wealth of data that we have to assist you in using data to speak the language of your executives. For market opportunity, the global revenue forecaster that I've mentioned today allows you to make reliable predictions of revenue based on localization. We have the Multilingual Digital Opportunity Series, which is our macroeconomic take on languages with worldwide info, regional takes, and slices based on the income of speakers of languages. And it turns out to be really important when you're doing this type of analysis. A lot of supporting research, such as premium customer experiences, focusing on how localizing things such as loyalty programs can help build customer experience outside your home market. Other reports, including calculating the ROI of localization and localization, TAM, and vertical industry, all help you with talking to executives in their terms. And then we have demand side data report, including, of course, the Can't Read, Won't Buy series of analysis, both for the consumer market and for B2B. And other reports and research around buying translation services, pricing models, and a whole lot more. And this is just a small sample of the data and research available.
Alison, thanks so much. That was really interesting. And just to share with everybody, we will be sending the recording of this to everybody that registered. So there was no, if you were scribbling down all those kind of data points and notes, you're going to get a recording of this later on. But yeah, there's lots of food for thought there, I'd say. So I have a question maybe to the other panelists. What are some of the challenges that you have with the way that localization and translation is perceived in your organization? Nancy, maybe I can ask that to you first.
Yeah, sure. Well, our business is obviously a global business by nature. We're present everywhere in the world with a consumer business, C2C business. So we cater to people all over the world. So for us, having content localized is just a requirement. We don't really need to justify the need to localize because it's part of the business. It's a very important part of the business. We know that we need to speak the language of our customer wherever we are. So it is more a requirement than a cost and something that is basically yeah, a bit taken for granted in that sense.
Okay, I appreciate that. And Christina, what are your thoughts? What are some of the challenges that you have?
I think it's a pretty interesting contrast to what Nancy was mentioning. I think Atlassian is a global company. As I mentioned earlier, we've just crossed over the mark of 200,000 customers. We're present in 209 countries. So we're a global company, but we are a pretty successful global company, which is very English-centric. Obviously, that's not initially. Atlassian was a company whose products were targeting initially software teams, developers who by nature are people that are very proficient in English. So I think to this day, we are challenging that mindset of why is localization important? Why is it important to take it into consideration from the beginning so that it is not an afterthought. And also because localization is not a function that is established sort of like top down, that is difficult, right? I think it's also like a bit of a vicious circle. How do we make localization strategic if we don't think about it from the beginning? I think it's only when you don't think about it from the beginning that then it is perceived as a bottleneck, because it's like, oh, oops, now we need to do this before we launch or before we release such and such, right? So I think in Atlassian, the challenge is like, it's great, we do see the value, but then in real life have to challenge that mindset and those behaviors to include it and to go beyond the nice to have concept that we've had for a while.
Got you. So an interesting contrast then between the two companies. So putting that aside then, how do you measure the effectiveness and the impact of your localization programs? What systems do you have in place at Atlassian, Christina?
I think that's the $1 million question to a certain extent. I think I hear, peers and many other companies trying to solve the same question. I think everybody, depending on, again, the challenges that you have, the journey that you're on, the maturity of your own program, you be in a different stage. For us, I would have to say that before we can even talk about dashboards of data points, it's been a journey of ensuring that we could even get the resourcing, because we're a localization team, we have our area of expertise. So you do need data analysts or data science resources to help you do that collectively. So that's taking us a while to get that, and then to create that relationship, and then from there to have the instrumentation to say, okay, what is a framework? Where are we going to start? One thing that for us has been, I'd say 3 things that are at the moment key for us. One is what we call our language prioritization framework, which is basically our first attempt to really consider different data points, to Alison's point earlier, to say, okay, how can we start creating a framework where we identify, either validate or reject some of the countries where we're doing where we support localization, or then just to really identify future opportunities. At the moment, we're capturing, just to give you an indication, data points that are pretty broad, like for instance, GDP, number of knowledge workers per country, penetration rate, and by penetration rate, what we measure is basically the knowledge workers against the number of what we call billable seats users that have an Atlassian license. English proficiency is another data point that we capture, and also revenue per country. So that is, again, a starting point for us to understand, are we going in the right direction? Are we making investments in the right languages and regions? And then take it from there. Another thing that comes up a lot is obviously ROI. In Atlassian, we call it ROLI, return on localization investment. And it's also, for us, is non-English revenue divided by the total localization spend. And I'll say this again, like, it doesn't need to be perfect. It doesn't need to be X, Y, and Z number. I think it's mostly us trying to show the business how are we trending, and show positive trend, and have that baseline to measure against year on year.
So ROLI, return on localization investment?
That's it.
ROLI. Nancy, how about at FedEx? How do you measure the effectiveness and the impact of your program?
Yeah, I have to agree with Christina about the fact that this is the holy grail of any localization team and any company, because it's extremely difficult to figure it out, and you gotta start somewhere. And I have to say that if in the beginning of this discussion I gave the impression that things are taken for granted, doesn't mean that things are working perfectly for us. So our effort to professionalize and centralize the localization practice within FedEx is quite young. We started around 5 years ago, and in a company this massive, it takes a while to think for things to gain momentum, let's say. So you got to start somewhere. Another difficulty that we have is that, in contrast to Atlassian, where you sell software and your presence is purely digital, so it's quite easy. Well, not easy, but it's not that. You buy the product online and then you see everything there. It's completely digitized. Whereas for us, our revenue is we have revenue streams digitally, but also non-digital. So it's really difficult to make this measure in terms of revenue. So if you start thinking about it, you might get overwhelmed. So you got to start somewhere. What Alison was talking about, like the operational or the purely localization metrics, I think even though I totally agree with her that you need to steer clear from those if you want to talk to management, I think those are very good ones to start with, just to know, like, also the scope of your work. So it's important to know how much volume you're handling. It's important to know how much money you're spending, how much your TM is leveraging, of course. But then you need to go to start talking management speak, let's say. So for us, our efforts have been focused on professionalizing and centralizing a lot of the localization processes, which were very decentralized before, and you know, selling this centralization as something that will eventually help the enterprise widely by having streamlined processes, things like what Alison mentioned about supply chain control, and all these kind of things. It's really something that we are working very much into towards too. And more and more we want to start linking our work with initiatives and goals of the company. I specifically work, or our team is actually under the digital team, and we're making a lot of, we have a lot of projects that will help or will make our website the place to go for our customers to find help, and therefore, for example, lower the amount of people that call customer service. So by localizing and having this content on the website, you should see a drop in the calls of in the customer service. So this kind of metrics is something that we need to start focusing on and see how we can link them to our efforts. Also, another one that is very important for us is NPS, and what really is, I think, challenging for localization professionals is because we're so focused sometimes on operations that we kind of lose track on what's actually we're there for, and we're there for are the customers that do not speak English. So we should be like more focused on that to make sure that that is our central point of focus.
I think you're making a great point, on Nancy, on something that I think it's for us something, and you're describing it, which is, I think as an industry, localization is so caught up with the whole ROI concept. And now I think more and more what we need to prove is that localization is a customer experience tool. So what are we enabling on our product, on the experience that our customers have from our brands through language, right? And I think obviously the finance part of it, again, going back to earlier, you need to show that it makes sense and that it's profitable to a certain extent, but I think it's beyond that. And to Alison's point, I think we need to renew a little bit the language of what is it, what are the key concepts that we are linking, that we are associating with the value that localization brings.
As part of my research right now, I'm talking to a lot of people about the metrics that they're using, and there's definitely some extremes in the industry. There are the ones that are just focused on per word costs and how they can measure it down to that level in a huge spreadsheet, and others that are saying we're not measuring LQA anymore, but we are counting how many new customers we get or new members because we've added a language, and counting the value of language and the quality of language by the reaction of their target customers. So yeah, it's happening, but not everywhere yet.
It is really like, like I said, sometimes it's really overwhelming because, of course, I mean, like I said, our team is like quite young. We're 5 years old. We have 2 teams, one in Europe and one based in the US, and we're constantly trying to. We do want to do data visualization and link our efforts to the business goals, but like it is overwhelming. It can be overwhelming, and there's so many data points that you can take. And also, I mean, the bigger the company, the more, and it sometimes it's like I don't know where to start, right? So I'm being very candid here. Like, even though we have a quite mature, we're very mature in our localization program in many aspects, this is still something that for us is a challenge. But I see that's a positive, right? Like, it's something that we can work towards and we can learn from it. I think all localization professionals should be more data oriented and try to figure out what the business objectives are of the company you're working for, especially if you're working at the buyer side. And if you're working at the vendor side, you should try to help your customer to see how you can add the value or show. It's not like you know that you're adding value, but showing it is very challenging, to say the least.
I think you touched on something interesting there, which is, I think there's no good data points and bad data points. It's which data points are useful for you. Because operational data points for Atlassian, for me, is keeping my house in order. Like, I really need to know how many words, what is my leverage, how much am I saving? Because then I would need to probably go to management to say, this is a volume, I need 1 more person or 2 more people or whatever, right? So that serves a purpose. But then you were saying, if your effort, for instance, is to centralize and to prove the value of that, you will need operational data for that. So in itself, is not good or bad, is really, does it serve the purpose that you're trying to achieve? Because I do feel that the localization team, it's like we're fighting many battles in itself, like the ultimate battle for what localization means, but also your own survival or your own sort of purpose within the company. And I think for that, you will need different data points for sure.
100% agree.
Okay.
Thanks everyone who's sent in a question so far. I'm going to actually ask a question that's come in because it's related to a lot of those points. Can you link adding a language to revenue directly, or does adding a language mean adding a market with everything that a new market entails? There is much more to it than language when we talk about revenue linked to a new region or market. Who wants to take that?
I would just say I would agree. There's a lot more to it. It depends on your product or your service. If it's a totally web-based product, then you've got very few other considerations other than language. If it's a physical product that you have to ship and you've got to go through customs and you've got all sorts of other things you've got to have on the ground, people, teams, a physical presence in each market, there's a lot more involved. So it would very much depend on the organization and what you're offering. But there has to be a way of measuring the effect of that language, even if it's A and B. You offer it, you don't offer it. What's the difference?
Understood. So one thing I was curious about, have you got any examples of changing a mindset within your organization, changing the mindset, changing somebody's opinion, see the actual value of a good language strategy. And we've got examples they can share.
Yes, I can. So one thing that comes to mind is that when I joined the organization 5 years ago, I actually joined a company called TNT, which is also a logistic company that was acquired by FedEx very shortly after I joined. And the language offer of TNT was larger than that from FedEx, especially in Europe. TNT covered many languages that FedEx didn't. So FedEx, and this is testament of how for FedEx, like, language is really important. It was not even a question. They were like, okay, we really need to expand our language offer to cater the customers that will come from TNT to FedEx, because if they've been spoken in their own language for so many years now, they need to keep that experience. So there was no question about that. But then we started looking at some of the languages that TNT was offering, and one of them was Icelandic. And Icelandic obviously is one of these languages that in terms of finding resources to translate is not that easy. So it's always one of these languages that is complicated to find resources, to find even people in the marketing organization that could help with evaluating the language and improving and all of that. And we also, so we offer the website in Iceland in Icelandic and in English. So we went to the data team and asked for data about how much traffic the Icelandic website had. And I mean, I don't remember the numbers from the top of my head, but we didn't even have to think about it. And we decided to stop supporting Icelandic and offer that content in English because it wouldn't make sense. So that was the only language that we dropped, and we added a language that FedEx offered that we didn't offer, that was Arabic. So yeah, it is one of these examples in which, okay, we had the opportunity to make an audit about what languages we're offering and does it still make sense. And with this example, we actually dropped one.
Okay, so you can drop languages sometimes. It does make business sense. What about the maturity of a localization program? You know, what impact might that have, in your opinion?
Yeah, it's a good question, right? Like I said, I think, not to toot our own horn, but we are very mature in many aspects, very mature in others, but the data still is a challenge. So we have a lot of operational data that comes from the tooling we use, and we can already draw a lot of conclusions from that data, like efficiencies or even language quality. But you know, data in terms of performance of the website in other languages, if there are certain points in the customer journey in which a language constantly is performing lower, and these kind of things is something that we still don't have access to, and we would like to start linking those or getting more of these insights so we can actually, you know, act upon it.
Yeah, and related to localization maturity and the age of companies and the length of time they've been doing localization, from the research we're involved in right now, I'm not seeing any great connection between that maturity or the maturity levels and the way that they're measuring value. Some of the most exciting things I'm seeing are coming from small startups that have actually turned it around, and instead of trying to take localization metrics and prove its worth, they are taking other measurements to drive what happens with localization. So if they recognize that the number of the access to their website suddenly drops off at the same time as there's no more localized pages, they might use that to trigger localization. and add more content in those languages. So it's a different way of doing things, and it's a really interesting perspective on how these companies are measuring the value of language.
Makes total sense to me. Like I see this, like digitally native companies are much more customer focused, more data driven, whereas companies like ours, which is a old school company going through digital transformation, is one of these let's say growing pains that we have. Makes total sense.
So the industry probably has an impact as well. I mean, so obviously we've got high-tech software, we've been logistics, and you've all worked in various different industries and organizations on both sides of the house. So do you see that? Do you think the perception of localization does vary across those industries as well?
Yeah, definitely.
I don't know who needs. This is the difficulty with online things.
Yeah, going back to the maturity and the industry, I think it changes, but I will repeat myself again in a sense that I think you need to understand what is it that the end goal is, what is it that the business is demanding from you, is in what do you need to enable / justify, if there is a need to justify something, whether it is centralization, whether it is value, whether it is bigger investment. And I think, yeah, to Nancy's point, I think there's just a set of different challenges every time, and then therefore the path will be different.
Understood. Thank you to everyone who's put in questions so far. We're getting a lot in. So another question we have: how much do you rely on TMS data versus other systems and other reporting tools?
Like right now, we are 100% relying on TMS data. Like I said, that's the only data we have easy access to, and actually, I think it's better than nothing. And like we said in the beginning, having operational data is like keeping your house clean. Like Christina said, you really need that data, and actually, it really, for us at least, we have. With the TMS we use, we do have data that is more than just TM leverage. You can actually dig down and check, okay, certain steps in the workflow can be automated, or certain languages are taking way too long. Why is this happening? Or in certain languages, the reviewers are making too many changes, like maybe there's a quality thing. So we have data in the TMS that is quite good, is operational, but we're completely reliant on that only. And like I said, we are really trying to see what other data from the business we can actually bring and could be useful for us, to Christina's point, because I think that we also, having data just for the sake of having data is not the point. It's like the data that is useful for you.
Yeah, I think from us, we do rely on our TMS, but it's limited. Like, yeah, to Nancy's point, it does give us an indication of, yeah, we want to know what is the workload, what is the turnaround time, finances as well is a good way to have an instant cost estimate for things. But other than that, I'd say if I had to pinpoint, where is our main challenge, it'd be completely going back to Alison's presentation. So other set of data. So in that, our reliance on TMS is, it's good to go back to the business once a year and say, this is how much we are saving by using TM, or this, or just to make tweaks on workflows and things like that, and have an idea of the workload overall. But that's about it for us, I'd say.
If you can take your TMS data and combine it in business intelligence with things like your website metrics, support case metrics, whatever data is useful for telling the story that you want to tell to the executives, that's where your TMS data becomes even more important, I think.
I completely agree with that. For instance, one of the big challenges that we have in Atlassian for the website is that it's huge, is a monster, in a sense that it has 2,000 plus pages in English alone, and it's different types of content. There is a lot of microsites for knowledge-based type of content, and therefore translating all those microsites, it was a huge investment. But then we pair that with entrance metrics. And to Alison, to what you were saying, we saw a huge uplift in the entrances to our microsites after we launched the localized sites. So that's right there an example of an investment that it is justified with real business metrics that we can show the business. So definitely, it's just that sometimes you try to go deeper depending on what are you selling, what instrumentation you have in place to measure certain things become a little bit trickier, but that's definitely a good starting point, and it was for us too.
I mean, there's a question that I've seen. Sorry, Nancy, go ahead.
It's a good point that you're making, and I know that some people from my team are attending. So we recently launched some pages in these languages or FedEx.com was launching these languages that were TNT languages and now are FedEx languages, just to say. So for example, Greek was one of them, the Baltic languages were one of them. So it would be interesting now for us. Now that I think about it, maybe a note to see if we have more customers signing up for Greece or for Latvia, because the content is now in their local language.
But isn't that amazing what you're mentioning? Like, that's happened to us, where you're kind of head down trying to push content translated, and then a few months later somebody will come and say, what happened to this page on such and such? And you're like, oh yeah, we launched that page, so that is the importance of connecting things. Otherwise, you're kind of lost in this kind of, earthquake that it is pushing translated content, but then connecting the dots is what really tells the story. And I think that is very much what we hopefully will do better.
There was a related question coming actually. Have you had to pitch for data specialist time or buy-in for the purchase of reporting tools? Have you had to do that in your roles?
Yeah, from time to time, like I said, when we made a decision from Icelandic, we had to have like a someone from the data team to check the traffic and all of that, but not task-based, but my dream is having someone dedicated to it. And I know Christina's probably has the same dream.
We've had an analyst dedicated to international marketing and localization for over a year now. I've been 6 years in Atlassian, so it only took me 4.5 years to get it. So I don't know what that says about my persuasion skills. But I think it's so important, going back to what I was saying earlier. It's like you kind of produce data out of thin air, you're not a specialist in that. We managed to find somebody, I mean, our analyst, I just love him. He's so great. He specializes in data science and linguistics. So he's like a unicorn coming out of, I don't know where. And yeah, that is important. Going back to what we were saying as well, like, yes, the operational side of things is important. Having the structure and the program set up is important. But if you're not able to measure it, how do you know that what you're doing makes sense? We've dropped Icelandic. We've dropped Romanian from our website. I mean, no offense to Iceland and Romania, but what I mean to say is that is proof of how much you need to be measuring this, because otherwise you're putting the money in the wrong pocket, and that should convince leadership in a company for sure.
Awesome. So listen, there are some questions that I think we won't have time to get to. We are going to, if you did ask a question that we didn't yet answer, then I promise we will get to them all in the coming days and follow up. I want to ask a sort of a final thought, really, from each of our panelists today. Nancy, give us a final thought on this topic.
I would say know your value, know what value you're adding to the company. So don't get too caught up in operation. Try not to go, because it's very difficult. You need to deliver, you know, but know that what you're doing is actually is incrementing the revenue of your company. If you are not there, or if the team is not there, then you're not going to be present in all of these markets, you know. So that's really valuable. And to Alison's point, speak CEO speak or business speak. Try to use that language. So be that translator that we all are. Normally, people who are in localization love this. You know, translating something into a language that somebody else understands. And keep on telling your story. Be patient. You need to be prepared to tell your story over and over and over again. I have slide decks and versions of them to talk to different types of stakeholders, to present it and to talk to them in different levels. Some people are very technical and they need to be presented it in a technical way. Some people are more financial oriented. So be prepared to tell your story over and over again, and know your value, know the value that you're adding to the company.
Awesome. Christina, final thought from you.
I relate so much to what Nancy mentioned. I think along those lines, I'd say, you know, what we just talked about in here, it's you need to maintain your operation, scale your operation, develop your strategy, show your value, make a business case for your resourcing. I always think that if you are part of a localization team, you are your own startup. And to Nancy's point, you need to keep marketing yourself and your team over and over and over, and have a lot of patience, a lot of persistence. And I think you need to really like what you do. Otherwise, why would you be here, right? But I think it's a mini company within a company, and it's so dynamic that, you know, it requires to touch on many things, but it's fascinating. So yeah.
Great. Alison, final thought from you on the topic.
What they said. Also, I would just say, you know, find those measurements that work with a top level company objective, and tell the story in the language of the people that are looking at that goal. So it may mean collaborating with different parts of the organization. For example, in support, if they're looking at reducing the time to solve, it may be a collaboration of metrics across localization and the support organization. And don't think you've got to count everything. It's just keep track of the meaningful data. You don't have to boil the ocean. And reach out for help if you need it. Don't have to reinvent the wheel.
Awesome. Some great tips. Thanks very much. Well, listen, I think that's about all we've got time for. Thank you so much to Alison, to Nancy, to Christina. Really appreciate you joining us and sharing your expertise and your opinions and your experiences. It's invaluable. I hope everybody who joined found the session very useful. If you want to continue the conversation, here are all our contact details. You can get in contact with us all. If you've got any further questions, any further suggestions, you can always reach WeLocalize at info@welocalize.com. Like I said, if you did post a question that we didn't answer, I apologize. I promise we will get to all those questions in the coming days. And finally, please stay tuned. Please stay tuned for future webinars that we'll tell you about. We want to keep up that knowledge sharing, keep up that information exchange. It's so important to us, and I know to lots of people in the industry. So thanks very much, everybody, and enjoy the rest of your day wherever you are in the world.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.